Nick Danforth had never been the type to tolerate disorder, and that philosophy extended to every inch of his home. When he bought the property, it was an overgrown wreck, a neglected lot with patchy grass, uneven soil, and remnants of past owners' failed landscaping projects. But for Nick, this wasn't a house to live in, it was a project to perfect. He worked tirelessly for months, removing old stumps, leveling the ground, enriching the soil, and installing an irrigation system so precise that every section of his lawn received exactly the right amount of water at the right time. He hand-selected the best sod, monitored the pH levels of the soil, and made sure the grass was cut at the optimal height to maintain a lush, uniform appearance. His lawn wasn't just well kept, it was a statement. A symbol of control, of precision, of his own meticulous nature brought to life in the form of an unbroken green expanse. So when Nick noticed the first tire tracks gouging deep into his immaculate lawn, it was more than just an irritation. It was a violation, a slap in the face. He had spent too much time, too much effort, and too much money for someone to treat his property like an extension of the street. At first he assumed it was a one-time mistake. Maybe a delivery driver who misjudged the curb, or a passing car forced onto the grass by another vehicle. He told himself it wasn't worth getting worked up over. But then it happened again, and again. Each morning he would step outside, coffee in hand, only to find fresh tracks scarring his lawn like open wounds in the earth. The pattern was unmistakable, it was deliberate. It didn't take long to figure out the culprit. Jack Randall, his neighbor from 2 houses down, had a habit of taking shortcuts, whether it was shaving minutes off his commute by cutting through side streets or skipping lines at the grocery store by pretending not to see them. His driveway, like Nick's, led to the main road, but instead of backing out properly, Jack had decided that Nick's lawn was a more convenient turning space. He would drive straight onto the grass, swing his car around, and exit at a better angle. Nick had seen him do it once in passing, but at the time he had given him the benefit of the doubt. Now, though, the damage was too frequent to ignore. One afternoon, Nick decided to address it directly. He waited outside, arms crossed as Jack pulled into his driveway. The man barely had time to step out of his car before Nick was already approaching, his voice calm but firm. "Jack, we need to talk about my lawn." Jack, a man built like a retired linebacker with the smug confidence of someone used to getting away with things, raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" "You're driving over it." Jack glanced at the grass, then shrugged. "It's just grass, man. It'll grow back." Nick clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay composed. "That's not the point. It's my property. I've put a lot of time into keeping it the way it is." Jack smirked. "Didn't realize you were that attached to some dirt and weeds." Nick exhaled sharply, reminding himself that losing his temper wouldn't help. "I'm asking you politely to stop." Jack rolled his eyes, spreading his arms dramatically. "Fine, fine. No need to get all worked up about it." Nick wasn't convinced. The casual, dismissive way Jack spoke set off alarm bells in his mind. People like Jack didn't change their behavior just because they were asked nicely. They changed when they had no other choice. True to form, Jack continued as if the conversation had never happened. The next morning, Nick found deep tire ruts running across the same spot. It was almost worse now, as if Jack had done it harder, just to prove a point. That was when Nick knew this wasn't going to stop unless he took action. He started small, placing decorative stones along the edge of the lawn, hoping to create a natural barrier. Jack simply drove around them. Next, he installed a low wooden fence, sturdy but unobtrusive. One morning he found it snapped in half, tire tracks leading straight through. Nick briefly considered installing a security camera to catch Jack in the act, but what good would it do? He already knew who was responsible. What he needed wasn't proof, it was a solution. He weighed his options carefully. Calling the police felt ridiculous. They had better things to do than mediate a dispute over a lawn. A lawsuit? Even worse. No, this had to be handled directly, in a way that Jack couldn't ignore. Something that would make it physically impossible for him to keep using Nick's property as his personal turning lane. That was when Nick had an idea. He spent the next weekend reinforcing the ground, but not in a way that was immediately visible. Beneath the layer of grass, he installed discreet, solid obstructions, concrete blocks buried just deep enough to remain hidden, positioned precisely where Jack's tires would land. He made sure they were placed at just the right angle, ensuring that if Jack attempted to drive over the same path again, he would be in for a nasty surprise. Then he waited. That night, Nick lay in bed, listening for the familiar rumble of Jack's engine. It came, just as he expected, followed by the unmistakable sound of tires rolling over grass. But this time there was something else. A sharp, metallic crunch, followed by a loud, angry shout. Nick smiled to himself. Jack had just learned a very expensive lesson. Nick had always believed that a man's property was an extension of his own discipline. He had spent months, nearly a year, turning his house into a place of order. His lawn wasn't just a stretch of green, it was a carefully maintained ecosystem, a reflection of his control over his surroundings. Every inch of it had been cultivated with purpose. So when Jack Randall, a man who lived as though the world was his personal playground, continued to treat that space as a mere convenience, Nick knew that reason alone wouldn't be enough to stop him. Jack wasn't the type to be persuaded by logic or politeness. He was the kind of man who only responded when consequences were unavoidable. The night Nick laid the hidden barriers beneath his grass, he went to bed feeling something he hadn't felt since this whole mess started control. He knew exactly what was going to happen, and when it did, he wanted to be awake for it. So he sat in the dim glow of his living room, sipping coffee, listening to the distant hum of crickets outside, waiting. It wasn't long before he heard it. The low growl of Jack's truck engine cut through the night, the same arrogant routine playing out as always. The tires rolled over the curb, onto Nick's lawn, and for a brief second there was silence, just enough time for the weight of the vehicle to settle, for the suspension to give under its own force. Then, suddenly, a sickening crunch split the air. It wasn't just the grass resisting, it was metal twisting, something hard meeting an immovable object. There was a pause, then another crunch, a scraping noise, and finally, an enraged, muffled curse. Nick set his cup down, stood up, and walked to his front door. He pulled it open just enough to see the street, the soft glow of a street lamp illuminating the unfolding disaster. Jack's truck sat motionless, its front end unnaturally tilted downward. One of his front wheels was caught in a rut, a deep gash torn into the undercarriage, something leaking onto the crushed grass. Jack stood beside it, hands on his hips, head tilted in disbelief, as if the universe had conspired against him personally. Nick leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching. He thought about stepping outside, about making some casual remark, something sharp but civil, something that would force Jack to acknowledge the situation for what it was. But he decided against it. No words would be as effective as the silent reality of the moment. Jack, frustrated and muttering curses under his breath, pulled out his phone. Nick could guess the call tow truck, maybe a friend. Either way, it meant he'd be standing there for a while, forced to confront the weight of his own carelessness. Nick almost felt a sense of satisfaction, but he kept it in check. This wasn't about gloating. This was about setting a boundary. The next morning, Nick walked outside to inspect the damage. The truck was gone, but the evidence remained: deep grooves in the earth, shredded grass, a trail of oil leading back to the street. Jack had been forced to tow his vehicle out, which meant he'd had plenty of time to think about what had happened. And yet, as Nick stood there, surveying the wreckage, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. And he was right. Later that afternoon, a knock on his door confirmed his suspicions. Nick opened it to find Jack standing there, arms crossed, his usual smug expression replaced with something colder. His shirt was stained with grease, his hands still covered in the grime of whatever last-ditch repairs he had attempted. "What the hell did you do to my truck?" Jack asked, his tone flat, accusing. Nick didn't flinch. He simply arched an eyebrow. "Excuse me." Jack gestured vaguely toward the lawn, as if that explained everything. "I know what you did. You rigged something under there. My truck didn't just break down on its own." Nick exhaled slowly, keeping his expression unreadable. Jack, you drove over my property. Again, I reinforced my lawn so it wouldn't keep getting damaged. If your truck got caught in something, maybe you should ask yourself why you were on my lawn in the first place. Jack's jaw tightened, but he didn't have an immediate comeback. That was the problem with men like him. They were good at pushing boundaries, but terrible at dealing with the consequences. He wanted to be the victim here, but the facts didn't allow it. Finally, he shook his head, letting out a humorless chuckle. You think you're real smart, don't you? Nick didn't answer. He didn't need to. Jack took a step forward, just enough to test the space between them. I don't give a damn about your grass, but you're going to regret this. Nick held his ground. I won't. For a long moment, they stared at each other, a silent war waging in the space between them. Jack wanted intimidation to work, wanted Nick to blink first, to back down. But Nick had already won this battle. Jack was the one standing on his doorstep, not the other way around. Eventually, Jack scoffed, turned, and walked away. He didn't slam the door, didn't hurl another insult. That would have meant acknowledging defeat. Instead, he strode back to his house as if nothing had happened, as if his truck hadn't just been towed off a neighbor's lawn in the middle of the night. Nick watched him go, then shut the door. He didn't smile, he didn't feel relief. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't over. And he was right again. That night, long after the sun had set and the street had gone quiet, Nick was jolted awake by a sound he didn't immediately recognize. A dull, rhythmic noise, not quite mechanical, not quite natural. It took him a moment to register it, but when he did, his stomach tightened. Footsteps, not on the sidewalk, not on the driveway, on the lawn. He moved quickly, but carefully, sliding out of bed and making his way toward the nearest window. He kept the lights off, using the darkness as cover, and peered through the blinds. A shadow. A figure moving across his property. Jack. Nick's pulse quickened, but not out of fear. Out of calculation. This was exactly what he had expected, and yet it was still a crucial moment. He could call the police, but Jack hadn't done anything yet, nothing they'd care about. He could go outside, but that would turn this into an open confrontation, and Nick had no interest in making this personal. So he watched. Waited. Jack moved toward the damaged section of lawn, kneeling down, running his hands through the grass. He was looking for something, proof maybe. Trying to figure out exactly what had wrecked his truck. His movements were slow, almost cautious, as if he expected a trap to be waiting for him. Nick let him search. Let him waste his time. Eventually, Jack stood, exhaled sharply, and turned back toward his house. He never saw Nick watching. Nick didn't go back to sleep that night, not because he was afraid, because he was planning his next move. Nick had always known that men like Jack Randall didn't simply stop when asked. They thrived on pushing limits, testing boundaries, waiting for the moment when the other person would crack and lash out in frustration. It was a game to them, a way to assert dominance over any situation, and the only way to win was to deny them the satisfaction of a reaction. Nick wasn't about to give him that. He had played this game before, and he knew that when a man like Jack realized his usual tactics weren't working, his frustration would build until it boiled over into something reckless, something that would eventually backfire. Jack was a man who wasn't used to being told no, and the moment his truck had bottomed out on Nick's hidden barriers, he had taken it personally. That much had been clear from the way he had stormed up to Nick's door the following morning, arms crossed over his chest, the barely concealed anger simmering behind his smug expression. Nick had let him talk, let him accuse, let him stomp around like a child throwing a tantrum, but he had never once given him the reaction he wanted. Instead, he had simply stood there, arms relaxed at his sides, voice calm and steady, watching as Jack struggled to maintain the upper hand. When Jack had finally realized that his intimidation tactics weren't working, that Nick wasn't going to flinch or apologize or scramble to defend himself, he had left, but not before muttering something under his breath about how Nick was going to regret this. It wasn't a direct threat, but it didn't need to be. Nick had known exactly what it meant, and he had spent the rest of the day preparing for whatever childish retaliation Jack would come up with next. It started small, as expected. The first morning after their confrontation, Nick stepped outside to find that someone had tossed a pile of leaves onto his lawn. It was a pathetic attempt at being a nuisance, a minor inconvenience at best, and Nick had ignored it completely. He hadn't picked them up right away, hadn't reacted in any visible way, and by the time he finally did clear them away, it was long after Jack had left for work. If Jack had been watching for any sign of irritation, he hadn't gotten one. The next morning, there was an overturned trash can at the edge of his driveway. The day after that, his mailbox had been nudged just slightly off-center, not broken, but just misaligned enough to be noticeable. Each time, Nick refused to acknowledge it, handling it with the same casual disinterest he would show toward fixing a loose hinge or sweeping the porch. But then, on the fourth morning, the escalation became obvious. A single deep scratch ran along the driver's side of his car, subtle enough that it might have gone unnoticed if the morning light hadn't caught it just right. The mark was deliberate, slow, the kind of damage done by someone who had taken their time, pressing a key or some other sharp object firmly against the paint as they walked past. It wasn't the work of random vandalism. This was personal. This was Jack. Nick ran a finger along the scratch, feeling the groove in the metal, considering his next move carefully. He could have confronted Jack, could have walked straight over to his house and forced him to acknowledge what he had done, but that was exactly what Jack wanted. He wanted a fight, wanted to see Nick rattled, wanted proof that his little acts of sabotage were getting under his skin. Giving him that satisfaction would only encourage him to continue. Instead, Nick decided to do something far worse. He made sure he was home that evening, sitting on his front porch, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a beer in hand, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He wasn't doing anything, just existing in the same space, watching, waiting. Jack noticed almost immediately. He had been standing in his driveway, wiping down his newly repaired truck, and the second he realized Nick was there, his movements slowed. He stiffened just slightly before forcing himself to appear casual, but the shift was undeniable. Nick didn't break eye contact. He simply took a slow sip of his beer and leaned back in his chair, making himself comfortable, letting Jack feel the weight of his presence. It was a simple thing, but men like Jack couldn't stand being observed without knowing why. They thrived on being in control, on dictating the pace of an interaction, and Nick's silence unsettled him. "You lost Danforth," Jack finally called out, his tone attempting to sound amused, but there was an edge to it. Nick took another sip before answering, his voice even, just enjoying the evening. Jack let out a short, forced laugh. "Didn't realize watching me was so entertaining." Nick shrugged, allowing a small smile to play at the corners of his mouth. "I find a lot of things interesting." It was nothing, just a brief exchange of words, meaningless to anyone else, but the effect was immediate. Jack was thrown off balance, and Nick could see the irritation flicker behind his eyes before he masked it with another smirk. He was trying to act unbothered, but the way his shoulders tensed told a different story. He stood there for a moment longer, as if debating whether to push the conversation further, but then he simply shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and turned away. The next morning, Nick wasn't surprised to find that his sprinkler system had been tampered with. The heads had been twisted so that they sprayed directly onto the sidewalk instead of the grass, an obvious attempt to frustrate him. It was petty, juvenile, and completely ineffective. It took him all of 5 minutes to fix, and once again he did it long after Jack had left for the day, making sure there was no visible reaction for him to enjoy. But that was the last straw. Jack had made it clear that he wasn't going to stop, which meant it was time for Nick to take the next step. That night, under the cover of darkness, he reinforced the edges of his property not with decorative stones or fences, but with something far more effective. He dug thin trenches along the perimeter of his yard, just a few inches deep, barely noticeable to the naked eye. Then he filled them with steel rods, spaced just far enough apart to make sure that any tires rolling over them would suffer for it. The rods weren't sharp enough to puncture immediately. No, that would be too obvious. They were designed for slow damage, the kind that wouldn't be noticed right away but would gradually eat away at the integrity of the rubber. Jack wouldn't realize what had happened until it was too late, until the damage was already done. Nick didn't have to wait long. The next morning, before he even stepped outside, he heard the sound he had been expecting. A loud, frustrated growl of an engine struggling to accelerate, followed by a sudden hiss of air escaping from a punctured tire. Then, the unmistakable scrape of metal against asphalt as Jack's truck wobbled unsteadily to a halt. Nick stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand, just in time to see Jack climb out of his truck, his expression twisted in frustration. The front right tire was completely deflated. Jack kicked it once, hard, then looked up and saw Nick watching. Nick raised his coffee cup in silent acknowledgement, his smirk barely visible behind the rim. Jack's eyes darkened, his fists clenching at his sides, but he didn't say anything. He couldn't. There was nothing to accuse Nick of, nothing he could prove. And that was what made it perfect. Nick had expected Jack to retaliate in some way after the tire incident, but the silence that followed was unsettling in a way he hadn't anticipated. For the first time since this ridiculous feud had begun, Jack wasn't making his presence known. There were no more scattered leaves, no more overturned trash cans, no more subtle acts of petty sabotage. Instead, there was only a strange, drawn-out quiet that stretched over the next several days. It should have been a relief, but it wasn't. It was a waiting game now, and Nick hated waiting. He wasn't a man who dealt in passive conflict. He preferred knowing what move was coming next so he could prepare for it. Jack had never been particularly subtle, which made this shift in behavior feel more like the calm before a storm rather than an actual surrender. On the fourth day of Jack's uncharacteristic radio silence, Nick noticed something that confirmed his suspicions. The tire tracks were back. They weren't as deep this time, not as blatant, but they were there, faint indentations in the soil, the kind that could have easily been overlooked if he hadn't trained himself to notice the smallest changes in his environment. Nick crouched down, running his fingers over the marks, feeling the subtle compression of the grass where the weight of a vehicle had pressed into it. It wasn't Jack's usual aggressive maneuvering. This was careful, controlled, as if he had taken extra precautions to ensure that whatever he was doing wouldn't immediately register as another act of defiance. Nick straightened, exhaling slowly as he glanced toward Jack's house. The driveway was empty. The garage door was closed. Everything appeared normal, but that only deepened his unease. Jack wasn't just continuing his little power play, he was adapting, learning from his mistakes. That was a problem. That night, Nick didn't sleep. He sat in the dim glow of his living room, waiting, listening. The street outside was quiet, the only sounds coming from the occasional rustling of leaves as a breeze moved through the trees. Hours passed, and then, just as he was beginning to wonder if he was being paranoid, he heard it. A car engine, running low and smooth, moving slowly down the road. Not stopping, not idling, just cruising past, barely making a sound. Nick moved toward the window, careful not to disturb the curtains as he peered outside. A vehicle, black, older model, difficult to identify in the darkness, rolled past his house at an unhurried pace. The headlights were off, the silhouette of the driver barely visible through the tinted windows. It wasn't Jack's truck. That much was clear. But that didn't mean it wasn't Jack behind the wheel. The car didn't stop. It didn't slow. It just kept moving, disappearing down the street, as if it had never been there at all. But Nick knew what he had seen. Someone had been watching, scouting, testing. The next morning, Nick reinforced his defenses. He didn't bother with anything elaborate this time. No hidden barriers, no buried steel rods. Instead, he installed a simple but effective deterrent motion-activated floodlights. He positioned them strategically around the perimeter of his property, ensuring that any movement, no matter how small, would be met with an immediate, blinding response. Jack wanted to play games in the dark? Fine. But he wasn't going to do it unseen. The first night after the lights were installed, nothing happened. The second night, one of them triggered at exactly 2:37 a.m. Nick was awake when it happened, already conditioned to listen for the smallest disturbances. The sudden burst of light flooded the yard, casting harsh, angular shadows across the grass. Nick moved quickly but quietly to the window, his pulse steady as he scanned the illuminated space. A figure, just beyond the reach of the light near the property line. They were standing completely still, as if waiting to see if the light was a fluke, if it would shut off again and allow them to continue whatever they had planned. Nick didn't move. He barely breathed. He just watched. After a long moment, the figure shifted, stepping back, retreating into the darkness. The light remained on for another 30 seconds before shutting off, plunging the yard back into shadow. Nick waited. Listened. Nothing. By morning, the only evidence that anyone had been there was a single set of footprints in the damp soil near the edge of the grass. They weren't deep, whoever it was had been careful not to linger, but they were there nonetheless. Jack had been testing the waters, seeing how far he could push before triggering a response. Nick had no intention of playing into his hands. Instead, he made a phone call. Not to the police, he knew they wouldn't do anything without concrete evidence, but to someone who could at least confirm what he already suspected. The security company he contacted agreed to send someone out to install a discreet camera system. Nothing overly conspicuous, nothing that would be immediately noticeable. Just enough to keep an eye on things without making it obvious that he was watching. The installation took less than an hour, the cameras positioned in key locations around the property, covering every possible blind spot. The footage would be recorded and stored remotely, accessible from Nick's phone in real time. Now, it was just a matter of waiting. 3 nights passed without incident. Then, on the 4th night, the cameras caught something. Nick was awake when the notification came through. He grabbed his phone, heart steady, and pulled up the live feed. Jack. He wasn't on the lawn this time. He wasn't near the property line. He was standing in his own driveway, staring directly at Nick's house. Doing nothing, just watching. Nick didn't move. He let the camera record, let the seconds stretch into minutes as Jack remained completely still. Then, without warning, he turned and walked back into his house. Nick exhaled slowly, setting the phone down. This wasn't over. Not even close. Jack had realized that Nick was anticipating his moves. That meant he was going to try something different. And Nick had no doubt that whatever came next would be worse. Nick had learned long ago that when a man like Jack started watching instead of acting, it didn't mean he had given up, it meant he was recalculating. That eerie night when the security cameras had captured Jack standing in his driveway, motionless and staring directly at the house, had only confirmed what Nick already suspected. Jack wasn't finished. He had simply realized that his usual tactics weren't working, that the petty provocations and reckless intimidation had failed to shake Nick into making a mistake. And when men like Jack realized they weren't winning, they stopped playing fair. The following day was unsettlingly normal. Nick spent most of the morning pretending to focus on work, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the image of Jack standing in the darkness, just watching. There was something calculated about it, something that suggested he had been waiting for a reaction, testing to see if Nick would acknowledge his presence, if he would storm outside or make some move that could be used against him. But Nick had done nothing, just like he had done nothing every time Jack had tried to provoke him before. He had learned to let silence be his weapon, but now that silence was working against him, because he could feel the weight of the unspoken threat hanging between them, Jack wasn't trying to bait him anymore. He was planning something. The first sign of escalation came later that evening. Nick stepped outside just as the sun was setting, his usual routine of checking the yard now more of a necessity than a habit. He walked the perimeter, scanning for anything out of place, and at first everything seemed normal. The grass was untouched. The motion-activated lights were intact. But when he reached the far side of the property, near the tree line that separated his house from the empty lot behind it, he saw them deep, deliberate gashes in the wooden fence, as if someone had taken a crowbar or a tire iron hacked into the panels. The wood splintered in jagged, uneven lines, the damage fresh, and though it wasn't enough to break through entirely, it was enough to send a message. Nick didn't react. He didn't touch the fence, didn't step any closer. He just stood there, staring at the damage, his mind already calculating the intent behind it. This wasn't random vandalism. This wasn't the mindless destruction of some bored teenager looking for trouble. This was personal, a way to remind him that boundaries meant nothing to the kind of man who thought rules only applied to people too weak to ignore them. Jack had done this to let him know that even if he couldn't cross into Nick's yard directly, he could still get close enough to leave a mark. Nick took a slow breath, turned, and walked back toward the house. He didn't call the police. He knew better. There was no point in reporting it without direct evidence. It would be brushed off as a meaningless property dispute, nothing worth their time. No, he wouldn't waste his energy on pointless complaints. Instead, he reinforced the fence. He spent the next 2 hours in the dark, securing the panels, adding extra screws, reinforcing the weak spots so that if Jack or anyone else tried to do it again, they would have a much harder time. Then he repositioned the cameras, making sure every inch of that section of the property was now covered, every angle accounted for. He went to bed late, exhaustion weighing heavy in his limbs, but sleep never really came. He lay in the dark, listening, waiting, every creak of the house making his pulse tighten. He knew Jack wouldn't strike again that same night. He wasn't stupid. He wouldn't risk being predictable, but the knowledge did nothing to ease the tension coiled in Nick's chest. He had spent his entire life controlling his surroundings, keeping order, ensuring that nothing ever slipped into chaos. But now, standing on the edge of something volatile, he realized that Jack thrived in chaos. The next day passed in a haze of restless anticipation, and by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Nick felt it, an unease settling deep in his gut, an instinctual awareness that something was coming. He sat by the window waiting, the live security feed open on his phone. Hours passed. Midnight crept closer. The street was empty, quiet. But then, just past 1 in the morning, the motion sensor tripped. Nick's gaze snapped to the screen, the fence. The camera caught the movement first, the grainy image shifting as a figure emerged from the tree line. Not Jack, too small, too quick, but someone, dressed in dark clothing, moving with purpose. The person approached the damaged section of the fence and knelt down, pulling something from their pocket, a metallic glint catching the dim light from the street lamp. A knife. Nick's fingers tightened around his phone. They were cutting into the wood, working fast, widening the damage Jack had already started. The person moved efficiently like they had done this before, not the frantic energy of someone acting on impulse, but the careful, measured pace of someone who had been told exactly what to do. Nick didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched as they worked, waiting, calculating. Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone, disappearing back into the trees without a single glance toward the house. Nick sat in the dark for a long moment, pulse steady, mind already shifting gears. This wasn't just Jack anymore. He had brought someone else into it. That changed things. By morning, Nick had already made his decision. He didn't call the police. He didn't call anyone. He simply got to work. He reinforced the fence again, but this time he went further. He installed metal plating behind the wooden panels, a layer of reinforcement that wouldn't be visible from the outside but would stop any future attempts to cut through. Then he moved to the yard, adjusting the motion sensors, recalibrating the cameras, making sure there were no blind spots left. Jack wanted to escalate? Fine. But Nick was going to be ready. The following night, the cameras caught movement again. Same time. Same place. But this time, when the figure approached the fence and attempted to cut through, the blade met resistance. They hesitated, pressing harder, but the metal held. Nick watched as they pulled back, confused, glancing around as if expecting an immediate response. But Nick didn't move. He just watched. The figure stood there for a long moment before stepping away, disappearing back into the trees. Nick exhaled slowly, setting his phone down. Jack was going to realize soon that whatever plan he had in motion wasn't working. And when that happened, things were going to get worse. Nick knew from the moment he stepped outside that Jack had reached his breaking point. The truck sat in the middle of the torn-up lawn, its tires half buried in the uneven earth, its headlights casting sharp, angular shadows across the damaged grass. Jack leaned against the open driver's side door, arms crossed, that same smug expression plastered across his face, the one he always wore when he thought he had the upper hand, as if tearing up the yard had somehow finally given him the victory he had been chasing. Nick didn't speak, didn't react, didn't acknowledge the destruction that stretched out before him, because that was exactly what Jack wanted, some kind of reaction, some kind of proof that he had finally gotten under Nick's skin. Instead, Nick kept his expression neutral, kept his posture relaxed, let the silence stretch just long enough for Jack to start second-guessing himself, because men like him only ever understood control when it was taken away from them. Jack finally let out a short laugh, shaking his head like this was all some joke that only he understood, the sound forced, too loud, too confident for a man who had spent weeks escalating a fight he was no longer sure he was winning. "You gonna stand there all night, Danforth, or you gonna say something?" he drawled, gesturing lazily at the mess he had made, his tone practically daring Nick to snap. Nick exhaled slowly, glancing over the tire tracks, the churned-up earth, the deep ruts left behind by Jack's reckless, deliberate maneuvering, and when he finally looked back at him, his voice was calm, measured, entirely unaffected. "What do you want me to say?" Jack's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly, straightening, squaring his shoulders, acting like he was still in control of a situation that had already slipped through his fingers. "I don't know, maybe something about how you finally learned your place," he shot back, grinning, waiting for the moment when Nick would finally crack, when he would lash out or make a mistake. But Nick had spent too much time dealing with men like him to fall for something that obvious. Instead, he took a single step forward, just enough to close the space between them, just enough to make Jack feel the shift in the dynamic, the weight of the silence pressing down on him, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but somehow even heavier than before. "Is that what you think happened here?" Jack opened his mouth, but before he could answer, there was a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible hiss, barely audible over the distant hum of cicadas in the trees. Jack stiffened, his body going rigid, his eyes darting toward the truck just as the front end began to dip slightly, a slow, steady movement that wasn't supposed to happen. Another hiss. Another shift. The smirk disappeared completely, replaced by something closer to confusion, and then, as if reality had finally caught up with him, realization set in. Nick didn't move, didn't blink, didn't do anything but watch as Jack's entire demeanor changed, as he lunged forward, grabbing onto the edge of the truck, peering underneath, his movements suddenly frantic, his breath coming quicker now. He tried to back away, but the moment his foot hit the gas, the rear wheels spun uselessly, kicking up loose dirt instead of gaining traction. The front axle was sinking. The undercarriage was dragging deeper into the softened earth. The same tire tracks Jack had spent weeks carving into the lawn had destabilized the ground, had weakened the soil, had turned the once solid foundation into something loose, something unstable, something that couldn't support the weight of his reckless arrogance. Nick watched it happen in real time, watched as Jack yanked the gear shift, as he slammed his foot down on the gas in a desperate attempt to free himself, but it was too late. The more he struggled, the worse it got. The truck lurched forward an inch, then sank deeper, the front bumper dipping closer to the ground, the sound of metal groaning under stress filling the night air, and that was when Jack finally understood. Panic flickered across his face, his hands gripping the wheel tighter, his jaw clenched so hard Nick could see the muscles straining beneath the skin. He threw the truck into reverse, tires spinning, the smell of burning rubber thickening in the air, but there was nothing he could do. The ground had already claimed him. Nick exhaled, slow and even, then turned and started walking back toward the house. He could hear Jack shouting behind him, the curses growing more frantic, more desperate, the sound of the engine whining under the strain, but it didn't matter. This was over. He didn't need to say anything else. He didn't need to lift a finger. Jack had done this to himself. He had spent weeks pushing, prodding, testing the limits of what he could get away with, convinced that there would never be consequences, that his actions would never catch up to him, that he could keep pushing further and further without ever losing his grip on the situation. But now he was sinking, literally and figuratively, trapped by his own arrogance, by his own inability to see the long-term consequences of his own reckless decisions. He had wanted to destroy something, to prove a point, to show Nick that he could do whatever he wanted without repercussions, But in the end, all he had done was set the stage for his own downfall. Nick stepped onto the porch, reached for the door handle, and then, just before stepping inside, he paused. He turned slightly, just enough to look back over his shoulder, just enough to see Jack still struggling, still trying to force his way out of the situation he had created. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments, and for the first time since this had started, Jack wasn't smirking. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't gloating. He looked small, insignificant, like a man who had finally realized he wasn't nearly as powerful as he had always believed himself to be. Nick held his gaze for a second longer, then turned away. The door closed behind him with a quiet finality, and he didn't look back. Jack's truck sat half buried in the soft, torn-up earth, its weight pressing deeper into the damaged ground with every passing minute, its front end tilted downward, as if the vehicle itself had finally realized the extent of Jack's failure. The engine had gone quiet after his last desperate attempt to accelerate out of the pit he had unknowingly created for himself, the whining of the tires giving way to the silence of inevitability. The only sound left was Jack's heavy breathing as he sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel with knuckles white from the strain, his mind undoubtedly scrambling for a way to twist this situation into something that didn't make him look like the fool he so clearly was. But there was no way out of this. Not now. No amount of bluster or aggression could undo what had already happened. Nick had watched it all from his porch, unmoving, his hands resting loosely at his sides as he absorbed the sight before him, as he let the weight of the moment settle over them both. Jack had spent weeks trying to prove something, trying to force Nick into submission, into compliance, into acknowledging some imagined superiority that had only ever existed in Jack's own mind. But now, stripped of his usual arrogance, stripped of the reckless bravado that had driven him to this point, he was left with nothing but the consequences of his own actions. And Nick didn't need to say anything at all. The reality of the situation didn't seem to fully hit Jack until he forced open the door and stepped onto the ruined lawn, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, uneven dirt as he took in the sight of his vehicle. He turned in a slow circle, breathing heavily, his expression flickering between anger and something far more uncomfortable, something dangerously close to shame. But Jack Randall wasn't the kind of man who admitted defeat easily. His pride wouldn't allow it. So instead of acknowledging the truth, he turned that anger outward, redirected it in the only way he knew how. "This is your fault," he snapped, his voice sharp, venomous, but lacking the same force it usually carried. He gestured wildly at the mess he had created, as if that alone was enough to justify his accusation. "You think you're so damn smart, don't you? You think this makes you better than me?" Nick remained where he was, his expression unreadable, his stance unshaken. "I don't have to think anything," he said evenly. "You did this to yourself." Jack let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "Bullshit. You set this up. You planned this," but the words rang hollow, even to himself. His eyes darted back to the truck, to the deep grooves in the earth, to the uneven ground that had been weakened by his own repeated trespassing. And somewhere in the back of his mind he knew the truth. He had caused this. He had escalated this. He had been so determined to prove that he could do whatever he wanted, that he could stomp all over whatever boundaries Nick tried to set, that he had never once considered the possibility that he might not win. Nick didn't move, didn't rise to the bait, didn't give Jack the fight he was still desperately clinging to. He simply let the silence stretch between them, unyielding, until Jack was forced to confront the only thing he had left, his own failure. Jack's breathing was still heavy, his hands still clenched into fists at his sides, but the fight was leaving him, bleeding out of him with every second that passed without Nick giving him an easy target. His shoulders sagged slightly, his gaze dropping from Nick's face to the ground beneath his feet, to the damage he had inflicted not just on the lawn but on himself. And for the first time since this whole mess had started, he looked tired. Eventually, without another word, he turned back to his truck, pulling out his phone and dialing for a tow. Nick didn't need to hear the conversation to know how it went. He could imagine the frustration in Jack's voice as he explained the situation, the irritation at having to admit, even indirectly, that he needed help, that he had gotten himself into something he couldn't get out of alone. The humiliation of it was probably worse than the actual damage. Nick stayed on the porch as the tow truck arrived, as the driver took in the situation with a raised eyebrow and a barely concealed smirk before getting to work. The process was slow, methodical, the heavy machinery groaning under the strain of pulling Jack's vehicle free from the earth that had swallowed it. It wasn't an easy job. The damage to the undercarriage made it clear that Jack would be dealing with more than just a bruised ego when this was over. And Nick watched it all, silent, unmoving, as Jack stood off to the side, arms crossed, shoulders tense, his jaw set in a hard line. When it was finally over, when the truck was free and the tow driver had secured it to the back of the rig, Jack turned one last time, looking back at Nick with an expression that was impossible to read. There was still anger there, still the remnants of whatever misplaced resentment had driven him to this point, but underneath it, buried beneath the layers of frustration and wounded pride, there was something else. Something that almost resembled understanding. He didn't say anything. He just got into the tow truck, slammed the door shut, and let the driver take him away. Nick didn't move until the taillights disappeared into the distance, until the sound of the engine faded into nothing. Then, finally, he let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting back to the yard, to the deep scars left behind, to the damage that would take weeks to repair. But it didn't matter. Not really. Because the fight was over. And in the end, he hadn't needed to lift a finger to win it. Jack had done that all on his own,